Today, let's talk about George Simmel. He was one of the most brilliant and, honestly, most overlooked figures in all of sociology. I mean, this guy was a total intellectual superstar in his day, but he spent almost his entire life on the outside looking in. And that right there is the central puzzle of his career, the paradox we're going to unpack. So how does that even happen? How can you be a world-famous scholar and yet be treated like an academic outcast in your own hometown? It's a real head-scratcher, so let's dig in.
I mean, just look at this contrast. It's wild. By 1901, Simmel's got 6 books out, tons of articles. His work is being translated into English, French, Italian, Polish, and Russian. A big deal, right? He even co-founds the German Society for Sociology. But what's happening back home in Berlin? Well, for 15 years, he was an unpaid lecturer. Can you believe that? Forced to live off student fees. He was totally shut out of running the university, and eventually they gave him this honorary title that was, well, frankly an insult. No real power, no salary. He really was a prophet without honor in his own land.
So you gotta ask, where did this lifelong outsider status come from? Well, to really get a grip on Simmel's revolutionary ideas, you have to go back to the beginning. We need to see how this feeling of being on the margins really forged who he was.
Simmel was born right in the heart of Berlin in 1858, but he was never truly on the inside. His family had a Jewish background, and even though his dad had converted to Christianity, that didn't mean much in an era of rising anti-Semitism. It was this constant shadow. On top of that, his father died when he was just a kid, and his relationship with his mom was pretty cold, pretty distant. So from the get-go, he never had strong family ties. He was basically an outsider even in his own home.
And that feeling of being on the outside, yeah, that followed him straight into his career. His life story is just this tale of incredible, brilliant work constantly bumping up against institutional roadblocks. In 1885, he starts as what they called a private docent, an unpaid lecturer scraping by on student fees. It took him 15 years, a decade and a half, to get even a token promotion. He's 56 years old when he finally lands a full professorship, and it's not even in the intellectual hub of Berlin, but it's some small provincial university. And then, just his luck, the moment he gets there, World War I breaks out, and he dies just a few years later.
So, why? Why was the establishment so hostile to him? Well, there's a great quote that kind of sums it all up. His popularity made many jealous, and his breadth and brilliance threatened narrow specialists. See, Simmel wasn't your typical stuffy professor in an ivory tower. No way. He was this dynamic public intellectual. He'd give lectures on everything from philosophy to art and wrote for popular magazines. And that kind of broad brilliance just didn't sit well with the super rigid German university system. Plus, his Jewish background just gave his detractors more ammunition.
But this is where the story gets really, really interesting. You'd think he'd become bitter, right? Angry? Nope. Instead, Simmel took his experience as an outsider and he forged it into a completely revolutionary way of understanding modern life itself.
You have to understand just how radically different his thinking was from the other big names, Marx, Weber, Durkheim. They all tended to see modernity as, well, a bit of a downer. For them, it was all about oppression, an iron cage of bureaucracy, or social disconnection. But Simmel, the ultimate outsider, he saw the flip side. He argued that the crazy complexity of modern society was actually liberating. He said it gave individuals more options, more choices. He saw opportunity where pretty much everyone else saw decay.
So how did he get to this unique perspective? Well, it all comes down to his secret weapon, his core analytical method. And it's an idea he brilliantly adapted from the great philosopher Immanuel Kant to uncover the hidden patterns of social life.
Okay, so quick detour into Kant. His big idea was that our minds are not just blank slates. He argued we have these built-in categories, like our basic understanding of time and space. And these categories take the chaotic flood of information from our senses and just automatically organize it into a picture of the world that we can actually understand. And this is where Simmel makes his genius leap. He creates this powerful analogy. He says, okay, if Kant's mind uses built-in forms to make sense of nature, then a sociologist can identify the built-in forms of social interaction, like conflict or exchange, to make sense of society. He's basically looking for the underlying grammar of our social lives.
And this really gets to the heart of his method. Simmel wasn't interested in the specific content of what was going on, so he didn't care if it was an argument about politics or an argument over a parking spot. He wanted to understand the universal form of conflict itself. His goal was to map out this hidden geometry of social life that shapes everything we do.
Okay, I know that can sound a little abstract, so let's make it super concrete. Let's put Simmel in the ring for an intellectual showdown with a thinker everybody knows, Karl Marx.
All right, first step, money. For Marx, money was basically a tool of capitalist alienation, and its value came from labor. Simmel completely disagreed. He said no, value is way simpler. It's just about desirability and scarcity. And, get this, far from alienating us, Simmel argued money is an incredible tool for freedom. It connects people across huge distances, it builds trust, and it dramatically expands our personal choices.
So what about alienation? Marx saw it as a disease caused specifically by capitalism. Simmel saw it differently. He argued that a certain level of alienation, kind of this decline in deep personal emotional contact, is just an inevitable part of living in any large, complex modern society. And he thought Marx's solution, a centrally planned communist state, would not only be a horrible authoritarian mess, but it wouldn't even solve the problem anyway.
Now this is one of his most counterintuitive ideas, competition. Marx saw it as purely destructive, right? It just pits people against each other. But Simmel argued that competition is a form of conflict that actually strengthens society. It forces people and groups to adapt, to pay closer attention to each other, to create value. In his view, competition ultimately gives people more freedom and can even lessen alienation because it forces us to engage with each other, even if it's as rivals.
So, after all this brilliance, you gotta wonder, why isn't George Simmel a household name like Marx or Weber? Why does he remain something of an enigma?
Well, a big part of the answer goes right back to where we started, his outsider status. Because he was never fully embraced by the academic establishment, he never really developed a dedicated school of followers to carry on his work in the same way his peers did. His influence has been immense, but it's been more scattered, popping up in bits and pieces all across the intellectual world. And that leaves us with a final thought, one that's especially relevant today. Simmel's life and work prove that being on the margins can provide a uniquely powerful perspective. So, in our own age of hyper-specialization, where everyone's kind of in their own narrow silo, what is the value of the outsider's view? What are we missing by not listening to those on the edge?